What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be going over my Diablo 4 Season 2 Stormclaw Druid build here in this video. Now, this build is something I've been theory crafting since the beginning of the season when they released the official patch notes, and man, I am super excited to bring it to you guys. Now, I will say this is my first official build video I am making as a brand new content creator, and I really wanted to bring you guys something unique that you haven't seen elsewhere, and something that's really fun and enjoyable in all areas of the game, and that can work in multiple areas of the game without really having to change too much to the overall build. But also give you guys some little wiggle room where you could possibly make this build a little better or just make it better for how you play the game. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and get into the build. Now, before we get started here, I would like to mention that I play this build on a controller and that this build is very user-friendly for controllers. So I feel like pretty much anybody could pick this build up and get right into the action without much learning curve there. So let's go ahead and talk about the vampiric powers, because that is the theme for Season 2, vampires and vampiric powers, and our vampiric powers are the cornerstone of our build here. They give us a ton of cooldown, a ton of attack speed, a ton of damage, and a ton of survivability. So let's go ahead and talk about them. The first one here we have is Hectic. Now, Hectic is really good because it gives us 2 seconds of cooldown for every 5 basic skills we cast. And we're going to be attacking insanely fast, so we're going to get a ton of cooldown off of this vampiric power alone. So this will potentially free up cooldown affixes off of your gear to maybe go into something else like resistances or attack speed or whatever you choose. So really great vampiric power for this build. And then Moonrise. Now, Moonrise is insanely good and a lot of the reason why we deal so much damage with a basic attack. And that is because not only does it give us an attack speed buff up to 20% at 5 stacks, but once we hit that 5 stacks, we end up going into a massive buff called Vampiric Blood Rage. And Vampiric Blood Rage gives us a whopping 160% basic skill damage and 15% movement speed for 10 seconds. That buff is crazy. And the only unfortunate thing I will say about Moonrise is that the buff does not refresh itself while it's up. So once the buff goes on cooldown, you will have to hit those 5 attacks, but obviously it will be attacking so fast. You can pretty much keep this up 99% of the time. So insanely good vampiric power for this build. And then Ravenous. Now, Ravenous is one of these vampiric powers that I read in the patch, and I was like, oh, it could be good, could be weird, sounds clunky, but turns out it is insanely good. And what it does is, with it on Lucky Hit, we have a 20% chance to increase our attack speed by 40% of our total movement speed for 6 seconds. Now, if you've played Werewolf before, you know you can build movement speed very easily on Werewolf. And as you can see here, our current bonus is 62.7%, 63% attack speed. I mean, we are attacking crazy fast. And the cool thing about it, and it's something I had to test out to make sure that it was a viable vampiric power and that we could keep up the buff consistently, is that once we proc the buff off of a lucky hit, it actually refreshes during the duration of the buff. That is a massive deal because once we get that 63% attack speed and we're attacking like a machine gun, we're pretty much keeping that buff up 100% of the time. It's a crazy good vampiric power. And then Undying. Now, Undying is basically masochistic from our spirit boons, but on steroids. So it gives us 3% life for every skill we cast, and it counts our basic skills as skills cast. So we're basically never losing life, and that buff doubles at when we're below 50% life to 6%. So clearly one of the better survivability vampiric powers for our build because we're attacking so fast. And then last but certainly not least, Metamorphosis. Now, Metamorphosis is really fun. It changes our evade, gives us a nice increase to the distance to our evade, and it gives us an unstoppable buff for 4 seconds, meaning we can pretty much stay unstoppable forever. And I'll show you guys why when we get into the gear pieces. So, phenomenal vampiric power. I love this power. I fell in love with it. I won't take it off. I just enjoy the evade animation and what it brings to my build overall. So definitely a wonderful vampiric power to have. Now I will mention a few others that are worth picking up if you would like to change any one of these vampiric powers. So the first one we're going to talk about is Sanguine Brace. Now obviously it's based off of Fortify, and it gives us Fortify off of a kill. But the big part about it is once we reach max Fortify, or I'm sorry, not max, it says while you have more Fortify than half of your max life, you gain 8% critical strike chance. So critical strike chance is really good because it's hard to come by. So a really nice source of critical strike chance if you decide to change one of these powers. Another one here that I like a lot is Anticipation. Anticipation is really good because it gives us 20% ultimate cooldown reduction. It's crazy. So you mix that with Hectic and you're pretty much casting your ultimate 100% of the time. And it gives us a nice little damage increase to our ultimate powers there. And then last but certainly not least is Resilience. Resilience is a great vampiric power to increase our survivability. It gives us 1% damage reduction for each 2% life missing. So you do the math, it is a ton of damage reduction and definitely a power worth noting. So those are my vampiric powers, guys. We'll go over them one more time real fast. We got Hectic, we got Moonrise, Ravenous, Undying, and Metamorphosis. Let's go ahead and get into the gear. Now, before we get into the gear I have equipped, I wanted to talk about the gear pieces in my inventory, as these were the gear pieces I had equipped before I got my Tempest Roar from Druid and before I moved into Mad Wolf's Glee for the end game. And it's pretty much like Season 1. So on your chest plate, you're just looking for a lot of solid damage reduction, some plus armor maybe, or some plus resistances. And the most important part here is, I would say, our aspect, and that's the aspect of might here, and that gives us that 20% damage reduction off of our basic skill usage. And because we're doing a Stormclaw build, obviously we keep this buff up the entire time. So you really just want to tank up with your chest plate. And then for our helmet, we want to get that basic skill attack speed. That's probably the most important part of the helmet roll. And then really anything else outside of that is just bonus. You know, if you want more tank, you can get, like I have here, max life or some resistances. If you want a little more damage, you can get a damage roll. You know, some plus stats is fine. All stats are willpower. But the most important part here is, again, the aspect of disobedience, because armor is still incredibly important here. Both resistances and armor are incredibly important, and you need to manage to get to that max cap on your armor for that 85% damage reduction. So disobedience is a phenomenal aspect that you will use on your gear all the time, every time, and one I never really take off my gear piece. Now, let's go into the stuff we have equipped. So the first piece of gear we have here is Tempest Roar. Obviously, if you play a werewolf build, you know why Tempest Roar is so good. Turns our storm skills into werewolf skills, so it counts as both. So we're getting a lot of damage addition from our Paragon board and different affixes on our gear. Really great gear piece to have if you find yourself lucky enough to get. And honestly, when you're killing Duriel, he drops uniques all the time, so I don't think you'll have an issue when you get to that point. Definitely put a Tempest Roar on. It's really great for this build. Then Mad Wolf's Glee. Now, originally I thought I wouldn't be using Mad Wolf's Glee, but honestly, now that I've been able to get to my resistance cap through my other gear pieces and some of my Paragon board points, I felt like Mad Wolf's Glee was a shoo-in. We get +3 ranks to our werewolf skills, and that counts towards our storm skills once we have Tempest Roar on. We get some movement speed, we get a ton of damage, and then some nice changes they made to the armor to give us a little bit more tankiness. We get that max life and damage reduction from poisoned enemies. Again, you could swap the chest piece out with something that you prefer if you need more tankiness. A different chest piece with a nice aspect of might or something like that would be fine. And then for our gloves, here we're just looking for a nice beefy attack speed roll, critical strike chance, and lucky hit chance. And then some willpower or all stats is my preference. Whatever it is for you is fine. But we're currently running Nature's Fury, so I threw in the Nature's Fury aspect symbiotic that gives us that reduction to our non-ultimate cooldowns of the opposite type of skill for a reduction of 5 seconds. So really nice for our cooldowns on top of the hectic that we currently have in our vampiric powers. We're getting a constant refresh on our bulwark with no problem, as well as our hurricane. And then our pants are just a standard pair of pants with disobedience here. And we're just, again, looking for our, damage reduction. You see we have 2 resistance rolls here. We got damage reduction while fortified, and then some all stats. And again, the aspect of disobedience here. And you can see on all my gear pieces, I have sapphires, as I prefer the damage reduction while fortified, because getting to max fortify with Druid is pretty easy. Then for our boots, and a big important part of our boots here. So we're definitely going to want movement speed, because we want that big buff from one of our vampiric powers. But we're going to want that total armor while in werewolf form, because we're going to be in werewolf all the time. And that affix is a massive bonus to our total armor while in werewolf form. I got a little resistances here just to reach that cap, and then some all stats. Now you could have all stats or willpower or whatever you personally prefer, but I like all stats. And then for our aspect here, we have the exploiters aspect, and that gives us a 20% increase to our crowd control duration, or if the enemies are unstoppable, we deal an increased 28% damage to them. And obviously those rules have a variation to them. But I want to mention a very important thing about these boots, and one I think you really can't change, so it limits your boot drops, but it's pretty easy to get them. But that is the passive that comes with your boots, and it basically has to have attacks reduce evades cooldown by 1.2 seconds. So because we're attacking so fast, we can constantly evade and constantly keep up that unstoppable buff we get from metamorphosis. That is why I prefer that passive off of our boots here. So that is my preference. I know a lot of people are using evade charges and increase to evade charges, but I really like the cooldown to evade here, because not only are we unstoppable, we're refreshing that buff with our basic attacks, and we're zipping around the map pretty easily through enemies. We never not have a dodge, and we're never not unstoppable. So that's, I felt, was something really important to highlight with the boots. And then the Crone Staff, the hallmark of this build, the unique you definitely need to make it work. And then the hallmark of this build, the reason why this build functions as it does, and that is the greater staff of the Crone, or Crone Staff. And that's because it turns Claw into a Storm skill and allows us to also cast Storm Strike at the same time, and gives a massive boost to the damage of those basic attack skills. And obviously we have some topazes, as that increases our basic attack damage, or basic skill damage. But you can see here why Crone Staff is so good, and then obviously you get non-physical damage increase, damage to close enemies at a huge 70% there, damage to crowd control enemies, and then plus 9 ranks to Claw. So really pushes our damage up through the roof, and pretty much lets us use this build as it is, as a lot of this build relies on lucky hit, and we know we get a ton of lucky hits with our STORMCLAW. With our amulet, we have some movement speed and total armor while in werewolf form. I feel like those 2 affixes are a must-have for this build. And then the last 2 here, damage reduction from close enemies or damage reduction while fortified. I feel like those 2 affixes you could probably flex into something else, like possibly some Envenom Rings or something like that. But the big part here is the rapid aspect. So basic skills gain a certain percentage of attack speed. You see here I got a 44% buff right there. So big attack speed buff. You can't go wrong with that aspect. So for our rings, each ring I would like to have critical strike chance and lucky hit chance. Now unfortunately I have not found a really good roll on critical strike and lucky hit chance yet for a second ring here. But we do have a nice critical hit chance roll here. We have some vulnerable damage. We have some damage to close enemies, which is really important for this build, and I'll show you that when we get to our Paragon board. And then we have some damage to crowd control enemies. So I'd probably remove that affix and go with some lucky hit chance if I get a decent roll. And the aspect on the ring here is the overcharged aspect. And that aspect is really good for this build because, again, we're going to be lucky hitting a lot. And I believe this has up to a 20% chance to lucky hit. My roll is currently at 14%. And it deals a ton of damage to the primary target, as well as giving us a little bit of AoE damage, because one of the cons of this build is that it does lack a little bit of AoE damage. And then obviously for the second ring, we have crit strike chance, lucky hit chance, and this is a better one. We got the damage to close enemies and some lightning damage. So a really good ring here. And then this is probably a flex spot ring where you could put any aspect you personally like on here. I currently have the Edge Masters aspect on here, which gives us an increase to our damage off of the amount of primary resource we have. And because we are not using any kind of core skill, we're just using basic skills, we constantly have a full primary resource bar. So those are my aspects and gear pieces. Let's move on to the spirit boons. So under the spirit boons for the deer, we're running weariness for that 10% reduction from elites. Then we are spirit bonded to the eagle, and we are using swooping attacks for that 10% attack speed, and we are using scythe talons for a 5% increase to our critical strike chance. Now you could probably swap either one of these into avian wrath for a 30% critical strike damage. It's really your preference. And then for the wolf, we're running calamity to extend our ultimate duration by 25%. And then for the serpent, we're using calm before the storm, and that reads out lucky hit. You know, nature magic skills have up to a 10% chance to reduce the cooldown of your ultimate skill by 2 seconds. Now for our abilities. In our basic skills, we have 5 points in claw, 1 in enhanced claw, and 1 in wild claw. Then we have 5 points in storm strike, 1 in enhanced storm strike, and then fierce storm strike up here. Now, these three are flex points. I'm just really testing this out, but we have 1 point in Earth Spike, 1 point in Enhanced Earth Spike, and that's really what I wanted to test out that stun for bossing, and then 1 point in Wild Earth Spike. Then nothing really for core skills. However, we did go into the passives here. Predatory Instinct for the critical hit chance, and then the Digigrade Gate here for the increased movement speed. Now for our defensive skills, we're getting 1 point in Earthen Bulwark, 1 point in Enhanced Earthen Bulwark for the Unstoppable, just bonus on top of Metamorphosis. And Earthen Bulwark in general I feel is needed for high tier Nightmare dungeons just because the barrier gives us a lot more tankiness. And then 1 point into Preserving Earthen Bulwark for that Fortify generation, because Werewolf tends to have a problem generating Fortify, and this pretty much solves that problem. And then 1 point into Cyclone Armor. Again, this could be a flex point. I prefer it because it gives us 10% non-physical damage reduction. Another way to make us a little more tankier into those higher Nightmare dungeons. Then I grabbed 3 points into Ancestral Fortitude for the 15% increase to our resistances. Then for our companions, I did go ahead and grab up Ravens. Now, Ravens is a terrible skill. Yes, terrible active skill. I don't even use it. The reason why I have it on my bar is for enhanced ravens, because they give you that 8% increased critical strike chance against enemies for 6 seconds after they're hit by your ravens. So it's really just there for bossing. I like to have that increase to my critical strike chance. Then for Wrath, into the passives here, we got Elemental Exposure 1 point, 1 point into Endless Tempest. We have 3 points into Bad Omen. You could probably flex this spot. You could probably take some out and put them somewhere else if you prefer. I might actually do that later, but for right now, I'm just leaving it like it is. And then 3 points into Electric Shock. And this is a really good passive because it gives us that chance to immobilize enemies on lucky hit, and then those immobilized enemies take a ton of damage, and we have a ton of sources of immobilize with this build. Then we went 5 points into Hurricane. We went Enhanced Hurricane, and then just the damage reduction from Savage Hurricane. And then obviously Neurotoxin to poison enemies. Then Toxic Claws because we use basic skills. And then really here in Venom, you know, we're getting that big bonus to critical strike damage when we attack poisoned enemies, which we always attack poisoned enemies. And then for our ultimate skills, we obviously pick up the passive here, Defiance. We want that 12% increased damage to elites. If you choose to flex some of your points, this is a great tree to flex them into. Obviously, because we're running Nature's Fury, we can use Natural Disaster for an increase to our damage. But really the best one here is Resonance. Resonance can give us just a flat damage increase for our nature magic skills, and then has a chance to increase it when we use a opposing skill from a different element. So if you flex points, you could probably flex them into this passive tree. But for our ultimate, this is also something that will change based on what you're doing. So for in-game dungeons, for Nightmare top tier dungeons, I would use Petrify, because that is usually what you're going to want to do, is stun up the enemies, because you'll kill them without no issue. It's really, you just want to stop them from dealing damage to yourself. So Petrify is really good for Nightmare dungeons, and then we pick up the point to increase the duration. But when you're bossing, I think Cataclysm is better, and it does a ton of damage to that single target over a longer period of time, and it allows your lucky hits to proc more. And then we pick up the 4-point duration into Cataclysm. The reason why Petrify is also so good for dungeoning as opposed to bossing is because Petrify actually hits through suppressors, the suppressor dome, so you hit them and stun them regardless, as where Cataclysm doesn't. So that's why I prefer Petrify in dungeons and then Cataclysm on bosses. You can choose whatever you like, but that's how I do it. And then for key passives here, I am sticking with Nature's Fury. However, Earth and Might is a great substitute, and definitely you'll see a nice amount of damage coming out of Earth and Might if you choose to go with this key passive instead of Nature's Fury. Now for our Paragon boards. Now, I don't currently use a build planner because I usually just make all this stuff up in my head and then kind of implement it into the game. But I will go ahead and find a build planner to use to create this build in that, and then link it in the video after I put this video out. So the first board here, we just kind of follow this path up here to the first rare node for some damage. Then we follow it up to our glyph slot here, and we use Fulminate. And that's just to give us, again, increased lightning damage. So I'll give you guys a second to look at it if you need to pause your video, and then we'll go into the next board. And then the next board here is just their Constricting Tendrils board. And then I start out here. I just kind of move along into the glyph slot first, and then I pick up Exploit. And then I move into the rare node Nature's Will, just for the nature magic skill damage. And then I do tend to invest a little heavily in this board. I like a lot of the rare nodes. We get nature magic damage here, plus damage to elites. Then we roll around, we go ahead and pick up the passive, the legendary node Constricting Tendrils for that Immobilize. And then we went into the superiority rare node for that increased damage to crowd control enemies. So I'll give you guys a second here to look at it. And then we go ahead into the next one. The next board is Lust for Carnage, that I use not because of Lust for Carnage, just because it has a nice little attack speed buff node here. 5% with some spirit. Nothing too crazy, but I do like the little attack speed buff. You could probably flex those points into something different. And then I move into this rare node, Regenerative, just to give the 8% healing. Nothing too crazy. Again, it's really just because it naturally flows into the glyph slot. And then we grab up the next glyph slot and Undaunted for the increased damage while fortified, and then the big one, damage reduction, the 10% damage reduction while fortified. And then these are flex points I chose to put into Feral, just to give me that 20% werewolf skill damage, as well as a little bit more willpower. Then we move out of this board. Hold on, let me go ahead and give you guys a second to look at it. Zoom in a little bit here for you. And then move into the next board. The next board is our Heightened Malice board to give us that poison damage for 3 or more enemies that are nearby that are poisoned. Pretty much you're always going to have that with this build. And we move into that first. We grab up the Heightened Malice legendary node. Then we pick up some poison resistance here with Poison Resilience. Really nice node here. Move along this path, and then we go down here. These are flex points as well. We go into Overturn, gives us that increased damage to poison enemies as well as damage to elites, and that is really good for bossing. Once we do that, we go into our glyph slot. Now our glyph slot here is werewolf. Obviously we get the damage reduction while in werewolf from this, plus a lot of damage while in werewolf form. So really great glyph to have. And we end up getting some sinking fangs because, you know, willpower is what that glyph uses. And then another damage reduction from poison enemies with nature born. So this is the Paragon board. And as it looks, the most important thing when doing these boards is just to unlock the glyph slot and get the glyph slot open, get the glyph bonuses opened up, and then go into your, you know, bonus skills. Anything that's a flex can be done later. Going into the next board, we are using the Thunderstruck board, and this is the reason why I have a lot of damage to close enemies, because of this legendary node. Now, it was changed from last season to deal critical strike damage to enemies to this new legendary node, which is Storm Skills deal increased damage equal to 20% of your damage versus close and your damage versus distance bonuses. And we get a big 35% damage increase just from this node. And that's because we stack out some damage to close enemies in our gear as well as our crone staff. So really great board to have, and I know it looked a little crazy when I'm sure I read it sounded crazy, but it actually works really well. So the first thing we do here is we follow up into our glyph slot, and we ended up putting territorial here for more increased damage to close targets as well as damage reduction from close targets. Then we move out of that and we traveled up here to this rare node so we can get some critical strike damage. Unfortunately, we don't have enough intelligence, but that's okay. We're really it's just a natural pathway to our legendary node, so that's why we end up picking it up. Then we follow it into the legendary node, Thunderstruck, and then we go out of that Paragon board. And I'll just zoom it in a little bit here so you guys can look at it. And then on to the last board. So the very last board here is going to be the Ancestral Guidance board, only because it had a really close glyph slot, and I knew I could get the points that were required once I could get my glyph to level 15. And we just moved along here to the glyph slot, and our last glyph we picked up was Spirit for that increase to critical strike damage, as well as that increased damage to enemies that we critically strike up to a max of 12%. So really nice glyph here. And then we just worked on grabbing those points here. Nothing too crazy. Grabbing those bonus points to unlock that glyph. So this is what it looks like. I'll zoom in a little bit for you guys. And that's pretty much the Paragon board as it is. So that's the build, guys. As you can see here, it works really well. I'm going to go ahead and add some gameplay here at the end, but let me know what you guys think about this build down in the comments section. I hope you really enjoy it. I hope some of you guys use this build. I think it's a phenomenal build. I plan on doing my tier 100 dungeon today, and I plan on doing Uber Lilith within the next week. So with all that being said, I'm Nico Rex. I am going to be streaming Diablo 4 on Kick at Nico Rex. So if you have the time, or if you'd like to kind of watch me play the game and ask some questions, come on over to Kick and watch me stream some Diablo 4. But that's all for now. I hope you enjoy the gameplay here added on at the end, and peace out. I will see you guys in the next one.
waiting in